Good afternoon, this is Clark Neighbors with BIS Commodities for the summary of the markets for the week ending October 24th, 2014. First on corn, for the week, December corn was up 5 cents. Now this is 12 cents off the high here on Friday's close with the overnight high. For the month of October thus far, we're up 32 cents. On beans, November beans were up 16 cents for the week. Now that's 25 cents off the high made this week, and 64 cents higher on the month. So roughly at 1.90 cent move to the upside in beans this week. This month. Over 40 cents this week. And wheat, December wheat. Let me back up. Penny and a half higher for the week. 30 cents higher for the month. For the month of October, the dollar is unchanged. Basically, crude down almost $12. And as we know, the stock market's had a nice bounce here of late, but still down about 250 points for the month. Cattle, we're up about $4 for the month of October on the cattle market. Very strange week, to say the least. Many questions from a fundamental point of view, why the rally. Much seems to be attributed to the strong meal basis and lack of pipeline fill in the eastern corn belt, especially meal in the East Coast. At one point today, there was some talk that theoretically you could import Argentine soybean meal and bring it to the East Coast, which is not a rarity anymore in the summer months, but obviously a rarity during harvest. There was also some talk that some European feed wheat would be coming into the East Coast, and this is more of a backstop as a supply mechanism, as the ability for rail and transportation being backed up here in the States is, for whatever reason, is easier obviously to get ocean freight to come out of Europe at a competitive price and go to some East Coast millers. So that's kind of an interesting thing, again, a strange thing to see in the tail end of October with a record crop. And again, as I mentioned, many are wondering why we're rallying as much as we are in the midst of harvest, and again, a lot of that has to do with the meal situation. But at the same point, when we're looking at this record crop, and yet the market is reacting like it has to ration demand, it's a little bit confusing when you step back away from it far enough. Typically, if you have a record crop, you're looking at ways to build that demand, in other words, at cheap prices. So we'll see how that affects going forward. A few other things factoring into the market here recently. Brazilian weather, looks like going forward weather in Brazil looks like more of a pattern monsoonal type rain system, which should help with the confidence of the crop as we're in the early part of planting. And then freight and movement will continue to be a talking point. Now with this harvest being stretched out, it's taking some of the concerns off of freight and the logistics and movement in this crop. But it's going to be a long year, so we'll see how that plays out as we go forward. And the other thing to keep in mind when you look at what's going on in this marketplace, there seems to be kind of a separation, if you will, from the western corn belt to the eastern corn belt. The western corn belt is not finished with beans, but very far along in the process of finishing soybeans, and has done virtually small amounts of corn harvesting in the western corn belt, say west of the Mississippi River, and east of the Mississippi River we've seen, as a general rule, pretty good harvest activity in corn. We're playing catch up in beans, again attributing to that eastern meal situation and trying to fill that pipeline into the crushers or the processors in the east. And at the same point, you're seeing basis differentials. You're seeing fairly strong basis in soybeans in the east between the crusher needing beans and also the very strong export trade we have going on. Keep in mind where the USDA's after USDA's announcement yesterday of 2 million metric ton of beans, We're at about 71% of the total commitment for bean expectations this year as far as sales. Normally right now we're at about 60%, so that's obviously another reason the market has been fairly strong. Now again, going to the west, in the west you're seeing pockets or areas with fairly strong corn basis, especially for late October, based on the fact there's not a lot of corn filling the pipeline yet, and a lot of this corn is going into storage or into farm bins. And even though there's this huge supply, you get to the point of talking about available supply, and we'll talk about that more as the winter months go on. But so keep in mind, basis in the corn in the west is fairly strong, but the bean basis is weak. In the east it's just the opposite. Corn basis fairly weak, again based on pretty good harvest activity and not much of an export program, along with the strength of the beans. If you're in the western corn belt, though, I would assume that between now and Thanksgiving, bean basis should see some strength and or improvement, based on once you get the crop put away, the farmers focusing on corn harvest, the lack of beans coming to town will be very limited. We also noted that looking at some of the local basis and trucking hours here of late, the supply of corn coming to town right now must be somewhat limited. Now the weather over the next week to 10 days looks pretty good as a general rule. It should help bring this harvest along. So a week from now, hopefully we'll have a better idea or better understanding where we are. Just a couple quick notes on the cattle. Cash cattle traded $170 this week, at or above what the trade was looking for, kind of matching where futures were at. Did have a cattle on feed report this afternoon. On feed came in at 99%. Trade was looking for 99.7. Placements at 101. Trade looking for 101.4. Marketing's 99. Trade was looking for 99.2. Looks like a fairly neutral cattle on feed report as we go into next week's trade on Monday. Keep in mind the livestock trade will have different hours starting Monday. There will no longer be an overnight trade. The trade basically will end at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so it will not be this 23-hour electronic trade in the cattle anymore, and the hogs. That's going to be abbreviated. In summary, again, strange week. Our contacts in Chicago are talking about, especially on Thursday, a lot of questions coming from exporters, coming from importers, coming from foreign buyers, etc., food companies, of what in the world's going on with the bean trade. More questions than answers at this point. Harvest progress over the next week to 10 days and forward will be watched. Some of this harvest may drag on in many areas of the Midwest because of the wet weather or the wet conditions in some areas, and we'll see how that plays out. Logistics, space, and all that is not as big of an issue even with this record crop as we move forward, because the market's had the ability to absorb some of this crop with these delays. Some were saying, we've used basically 16-17% of this crop thus far since the 1st of September. If you have any questions, feel free to call us at BIS Commodities. Phone number is 800-373-2525. Catch us on the web, biscommodities.com, or on Twitter, BIS_commodities. With that, have a great weekend.